Opening a morning newspaper in the year 1800, you expect to read polite political debates about taxes or foreign policy. Instead, you read a headline that explicitly calls the sitting president of the United States a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man with a hideous character. You drop your coffee in shock. Then, you pick up a rival newspaper supporting the other political party. This paper claims that if the opposing candidate wins the election, murder, robbery, rape, and adultery will be openly taught and practiced across the nation. They warn that he is a bloodthirsty atheist who will literally bring the French guillotine to America and chop off the heads of honest Christians. This was not a modern internet comment section. This was the presidential election of 1800. It was a vicious, highly toxic, and deeply personal war between two brilliant founding fathers, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Today, for our Season 2 finale, we dive into the darkest political mud wrestling match in American history. We will witness the government violently turning against its own citizens, a mathematical disaster that paralyzed the Constitution, and the unbelievable moment when Alexander Hamilton chose to save his worst enemy in order to save the United States. To understand why the Founding Fathers were suddenly trying to destroy each other, we have to look at the massive power vacuum left by George Washington. When Washington retired to his farm, his vice president, John Adams, won the election of 1796 and became the second president. But John Adams had an impossible job. He had to follow a living legend. Adams was a brilliant, deeply patriotic man, but he was also stubborn, highly insecure, and prone to explosive fits of anger. From the moment Adams took office, the world seemed to be collapsing around him. The French Revolution had turned into a global bloodbath. France and Britain were locked in a massive war, and the French Navy began aggressively attacking American merchant ships in the Atlantic. The United States and France entered into an undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War. Paranoia swept through the American capital. The Federalist Party, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, firmly believed that French spies were infiltrating the country. They were terrified that Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party were actively conspiring with the French to launch a violent, bloody revolution on American soil. Driven by this overwhelming fear, President John Adams made the darkest, most oppressive mistake of his entire political career. In 1798, he signed a series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act was a direct, unapologetic assault on the First Amendment of the Constitution. It made it a federal crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or the president. In reality, this meant that if you criticized John Adams in a newspaper, you would go to prison. The Federalists unleashed a wave of political terror. They aggressively shut down opposition newspapers. They arrested dozens of editors and journalists who supported Thomas Jefferson. They even arrested a sitting member of the United States Congress from Vermont. For writing a single sentence criticizing the president, a federal judge threw him into a freezing, filthy dungeon for 4 months. The American public was absolutely horrified. They had just fought a brutal war against the British to secure the right of free speech, and now their own government was tightly locking them in chains for expressing a political opinion. Thomas Jefferson, serving as the vice president, realized that the Republic was on the verge of becoming a tyranny. He secretly began writing resolutions, arguing that individual states had the right to completely ignore unconstitutional federal laws. The country was dangerously close to shattering. This was the incredibly toxic environment heading into the presidential election of 1800. It was a rematch, President John Adams versus Vice President Thomas Jefferson. The campaigns were completely devoid of morality. The Federalists attacked Jefferson's character, his religion, and his personal life. The Democratic Republicans fought back with equal venom, portraying Adams as a corrupt, power-hungry monarchist. When the votes were finally counted in December, the Federalists had lost. The American people were deeply exhausted by the Sedition Act and the heavy taxes. Thomas Jefferson had successfully defeated John Adams. The Democratic Republicans celebrated wildly in the streets. But their joy instantly evaporated when they looked closely at the complex mathematics of the Electoral College. The early Constitution had a massive, highly dangerous flaw in its voting system. Electors did not vote separately for president and vice president. They simply cast 2 votes. The man with the most votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. The Democratic-Republican Party wanted Thomas Jefferson to be president, and they wanted a cunning, highly ambitious New York politician named Aaron Burr to be vice president. The plan was for all the electors to vote for both Jefferson and Burr, except for one elector who was supposed to throw away his second vote. But the plan failed. Someone forgot to throw away their vote. When the electoral ballots were opened, the result was a catastrophic tie. Thomas Jefferson received exactly 73 votes. Aaron Burr received exactly 73 votes. According to the Constitution, in the event of a tie, the decision goes directly to the House of Representatives. But there was a terrifying twist. The House of Representatives that had to break the tie was the old Congress, which was still firmly controlled by the Federalist Party. The Federalists now held the ultimate power to decide who would lead their enemies. Many Federalists looked at Aaron Burr and smiled. They knew Thomas Jefferson was a man of strong, unwavering principles. They hated his principles, but he had them. Aaron Burr, on the other hand, was an opportunistic chameleon. He had no firm beliefs. He only cared about his own personal advancement. Many Federalists realized they could easily manipulate Burr. They decided to vote for Aaron Burr to steal the presidency away from Jefferson. Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be Jefferson's loyal vice president, stayed completely silent. He refused to step aside. In February 1801, the House of Representatives gathered in the unfinished, muddy city of Washington to vote. The tension was suffocating. Outside the Capitol building, the governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania were secretly mobilizing their state militias. They threatened to march on Washington and use physical violence if the Federalists tried to steal the election. The United States was standing on the absolute edge of a massive, bloody civil war. The Congress voted. The result was a deadlock. They voted again, another deadlock. For 6 agonizing days, they voted 35 separate times. 35 times, neither man could secure the majority required to win. The government was completely paralyzed. The nation needed someone to break the stalemate. They needed a voice of authority to influence the Federalist politicians. That voice came from Alexander Hamilton. He had spent his entire political career fighting a vicious, bitter war against Thomas Jefferson. He despised Jefferson's vision for America. But Hamilton also knew Aaron Burr very well. They were both lawyers in New York. Hamilton firmly believed that Burr was a deeply corrupt, dangerous narcissist. Hamilton sat at his desk and began writing a frantic, highly aggressive stream of letters to his Federalist allies in Congress. He begged them not to vote for Burr. Hamilton wrote that Mr. Jefferson is a lover of liberty, but Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself. Hamilton argued that if you put a man with wrong principles in charge, the country will survive. But if you give absolute power to a man with no principles at all, he will destroy the republic for his own glory. It was an incredibly painful, highly selfless decision. Hamilton deliberately used his immense political capital to secure the presidency for his absolute worst enemy, simply because he believed it was the right thing for the survival of the country. Hamilton's letters slowly changed minds. On February 17, 1801, the House of Representatives held its 36th ballot. Finally, the deadlock broke. The Federalist representatives submitted blank ballots, allowing Thomas Jefferson to win the majority. The crisis was over. Thomas Jefferson was officially the 3rd president of the United States. Aaron Burr became vice president, but he never forgave Alexander Hamilton for destroying his ultimate dream. That burning hatred would eventually lead them to a foggy duel in New Jersey. The real miracle of the election of 1800 happened a few weeks later on Inauguration Day. John Adams had been brutally defeated. He was deeply bitter and heavily depressed. He had the power of the army and the presidency. In any other country, a defeated leader would have called out the troops and firmly held onto his throne. But John Adams did not do that. Before the sun came up on the morning of March 4, 1801, Adams quietly packed his bags, stepped into a wooden carriage, and left Washington. He went home to Massachusetts. He peacefully, voluntarily, handed over the supreme power of the government to his most bitter political enemy. It was the first time in modern human history that control of a nation was transferred from one political faction to another without a single drop of blood being spilled. The American experiment had survived its darkest hour. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel.